All right, welcome to the second panel of this magnificent conference. My name is Hussein Askari. I'm the Southwest Asia coordinator for the Schiller Institute. I just want to start by saying, although I'm a very proud Iraqi-born citizen, I'm raised as an Arab Muslim, but I'm also a European. I have spent almost all my adult life in Europe, in Norway and in Sweden, and I'm very proud to be Swedish European too. My kids are born and raised up in Sweden as European citizens. So I care a lot about Europe. I'm worried about Europe. So when I criticize Europe or European policy, I'm not an outsider throwing stones on a house of glass. I'm actually speaking from inside the fragile house of glass, which is called Europe. Anyway, so I just wanted to start with this. This report, which we have now fresh from the press, with the same title as my presentation, I co-authored with my colleague in the Schiller Institute, Jason Ross. It is inspired by the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche and the incredible fight launched by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the Schiller Institute, and the LaRouche movement worldwide in the past 25 years to make the dream of the new Silk Road a reality. There's nothing unrealistic about what I'm presenting here about Southwest Asia and Africa. The reason I'm optimistic is that the new paradigm in international relations has taken hold, and the old imperial order is fading away. The other more subjective reason for being optimistic is that we will continue fighting to make this happen. The empire, of course, is still dangerously lurking like a wounded tiger, and it might attack at any moment. However, the ideology of the empire and its axioms and beliefs about the relationship between man and nature, between man, and between nation and nation will continue to be a source of danger to the human race. For example, the belief that money makes things happen, or the environmentalist idea that human activities to develop and raise the living standards of society always negatively affect nature and the environment, and that humans should simply be prevented from growing in numbers and in standards of living. But through China's constructive interventions, this is being pushed back, as we described in detail in this report. And I think everybody should have a copy of this report. It's important for you, for your family, for your friends, and for your country. So read it and keep a copy. So in 2030, you can look back at the world and see what has happened. One very important point which must be emphasized always is that neither I nor the Schiller Institute, or for that matter, I think China, is intending to impose or dictate policies to the African nations. What we are offering is a friendly advice, lessons that other nations had learned the hard way, and of course, certain universal scientific, cultural, and moral principles that apply to all human societies. African nations, and each one of them as an independent and sovereign nation, have to choose to join this development by their own will. Now, Southwest Asia and West Asia, or West Asia we call it also in the report, and Africa have been associated with wars, mass immigrations, famine, and epidemics. But this is about to change, as the winds of the new Silk Road blow into the sails of the new paradigm, which is led by the BRICS nations and China specifically. In January 2016, the Chinese President Xi Jinping visited 3 Southwest Asia's major countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran were deeply involved in different sides of the war in Syria. 1 week before the visit, the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued the first ever China-Arab World Policy paper, in which China's contribution to the region is defined by extending the new Silk Road to this region and cooperating with these nations on large-scale transport infrastructure projects, nuclear power, fighting desertification, and so on. China is offering the rest of the developing world all its experience in development and poverty reduction. This is the first time a major power opens its entire technological toolkit to other nations. Southwest Asia and the Horn of Africa have unique characteristics. A fantastic geographical location between Asia, Africa, and Europe. It contains 2/3 of the world's petroleum reserves, nearly $2 trillion in foreign currency reserves in the sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf countries alone, and most importantly, about 400 million people, most of them are below the age of 30. This region is very hungry for technology and investments in infrastructure, transport, power, water, telecommunications, and so on. This is, in other words, potentially one of the greatest markets for capital goods on earth. The governments of the region themselves realize now the importance of cooperation with the East to build their physical economies. Nations that are coming out of destructive wars like Syria and Iraq, and others who are still waiting, like Yemen and Afghanistan, will require enormous technological and logistical input to rebuild themselves. Actually, we had one of our speakers was supposed to speak today. She couldn't come here. It's Mrs. Buthaina Shaban. I have to divert a bit from my original presentation. Dr. Buthaina Shaban is the political and media advisor of President Bashar al-Assad of Syria. She was supposed to talk about Syria's reconstruction in light of the new Silk Road and One Belt and One Road. She couldn't come for very good reasons. So I'm just replacing her quickly to say that we in the Schiller Institute have presented a policy for reconstruction of Syria within the framework of the new Silk Road. It's called Project Phoenix. We have discussed this in other conferences. We presented it to the Syrian government in 2014, and it has been informally accepted by the Syrian government. They now work very intensively, of course, on rebuilding their country, but they are including the idea of the One Belt, One Road in their construction of their country. So there is this plan for reconstruction of Syria. We have it otherwise, so I'm not going to discuss it. The reason Mrs. Shaban couldn't come today, because yesterday she was in China, meeting the foreign minister of China and other officials to present Syria's reconstruction plan and expressing her support and the Syrian government's support for the One Belt and One Road. And the Chinese foreign minister and other officials expressed their willingness to participate in the reconstruction of Syria. Now, as Helga said, something big is going on between President Putin, President Xi Jinping, President Trump, President al-Sisi of Egypt, and even with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. There is a grand design in the works. We don't know the details, but everything is pointing into the positive direction that we could once and for all get rid of this so-called Islamic terrorism, but also start a reconstruction process for all Southwest Asia, and then leading to also to Africa. So my colleague Ulf Sandmark has been in Syria a couple of times presenting our plans. Here he is with Mrs. Shaban, Dr. Shaban, and Dr. Talal Mualla in his recent visit. They are very close friends, and we discussed this idea of the One Belt, One Road the whole time. So I wish her all the luck, and for Syria. Okay. Egypt, which we heard today, is a natural bridge between the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, between Asia and Africa, is already positioning itself to take the lead in this process. With the expansion of the Suez Canal and establishment of new industrial zones and investing in transforming its transport networks to adapt them to the Belt and Road Initiative. Through Egypt and the Maritime Silk Road, we arrived to Africa, and Africa is a major focus, actually, of our report, because we have discussed Southwest Asia more, and so there's a lot of focus in the report we have and also in my presentation in Africa. So African nations have had many development plans since the 1970s, since independence, but Helga mentioned the Lagos plan of action. Also, although we were critical to it, it included some interesting features like building the Trans-African Highway network between all the capitals of Africa, connecting the whole. But none of these projects, of course, saw the light of the day because the concepts behind them and because of the system which existed then were not correct. But the idea now is that all these different kinds of projects are pointing to the same direction of the old paradigm of geopolitics, pitting one nation and one tribe against the other, focusing on taking riches out of Africa and giving nothing back except weapons, so that the guerrilla groups continue to protect the gold, diamond, and cobalt mines or oil fields. So that has been the policy which prevented Africa's development to a large extent. The typical attitude in Europe and the United States toward Africa is negative. Africa represents famine, poverty, epidemics, civil wars, dictatorships, etc., etc. However, China's attitude is that all these problems, or resolving these problems, is a great opportunity because the remedy exists and it has been applied in none other than China itself with incredible results. China and Africa now, of course, according to a report issued earlier this year by McKinsey Consulting, is the #1 trade partner of Africa, the #1 infrastructure builder in Africa, the #1 in the growth, and mind this, #1 in the growth of direct foreign investments, and the 3rd in aid, and so on and so forth. This is the result of many years of consistent Chinese policy of technology transfer, win-win cooperation. Referring to China's experience, President Xi Jinping said at the December 2015 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which our previous speaker from China, Professor Wenping, mentioned, he said, industrialization is an inevitable path to a country's economic success. Within a short span of several decades, China has accomplished what took developed countries hundreds of years to accomplish, and put in place a complete industrial system with an enormous productive capacity. He encouraged African leaders to pursue a path of industrialization, a call never heard from leaders of the industrial nations in the West. President Xi stated, "It is entirely possible for Africa, as the world's most promising region in terms of development potential, to bring into play its advantages and achieve great success. The achievements of inclusive and sustainable development in Africa hinges on industrialization," very important word, "which holds the key to creating jobs, eradicating poverty, and improving people's living standards." To give you a clear picture of the two different attitudes, I would like to present some data here. As I said, China is the #1 in the rate of increase for direct foreign investment, but China is not the largest investor in Africa. The largest investors in Africa are the United States and Britain. But it's interesting to look at where they are investing. So this is a comparison between the Chinese and US foreign direct investment. You can see that the United States investments are focused in majority on mining. That's oil, minerals, and so on. 7% manufacturing, and so on. But if you look at the Chinese diversification of investment, it's the largest ones. The largest part is in construction and mining, but also manufacturing. There's the scientific research and technology services. So there's a big difference between where the United States and Britain invest. This is British investments also in the same 10 years. There's a breakdown. In the red is mining, and in the blue is financial services. That's taking money out of Africa, basically, or loaning money to Africa. But that's the kind of investments you have in difference. So people accuse China of being in Africa for the sake of the minerals of Africa and the natural resources. The truth is that the accusers of China are the ones who are doing it. But as Helga said, to cover their own intentions. Not only the attitude towards Africa must change, but the very prevalent way of looking at economic development must. As we point out in the speech of President Xi in the Johannesburg China-Africa Cooperation Forum, the new definition of sustainable development is industrialization. Another issue is mega projects. Mega projects are back. This is a very bad word in Europe and the United States. Nobody likes that. But mega projects are back. And they are not, as the media in the West said, pharaonic projects built to glorify dictators, but to transform whole economies, nations, and even whole continents. The other issue is that, as my colleagues, Jason put it in the report, Africa must leap ahead but not crawl forward. Now, of course, there's a big problem with how China's role is being showed in Western media, is that China's positive involvement in Africa provoked a massive campaign of lies in Western media and think tanks, a large-scale brainwashing campaign based on lies which has affected many people's attitudes towards China, even among many Africans. I take just one example, a specific case study, which is called land grabbing. Now, everybody here must have heard somewhere or read someplace that China is taking land in Africa to produce food for China. Now, we looked at some of these things, and it's documented in the reports. We have this very special case. Helga mentioned an article by Lester Brown this morning. All these things are based not on scientific studies or field studies or economic studies. It's just articles, and these articles are circulated in the media, and then people copy them, and then people quote these articles, and then they become scientific studies suddenly. You know, it's like the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, you know, the use of chemical weapons in Syria, but this is a very good example. And it says there, this is an article from The Guardian, in the middle of the worst food crisis in this century, it says, you know, you can see the headline, "The Food Rush, Rising Demand in China and West Sparks Africa Land Grab." But if you look there in the header there, it says, "1 million Chinese farmers have joined the rush to Africa, according to one estimate." Underlining concerns that an unchecked land grab not seen since the 19th century is underway. Now, they refer to an estimate, a report, which was issued by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Program. So I clicked on it, and I read the report. And there's nothing in the report about 1 million Chinese farmers going to Africa. Nothing. To the contrary, I mean, the problem is that maybe the Guardian newspaper, they believe that their readers are so lazy they will never click on the link to the report, which is typical today. What the report says, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization says, it says, however, the report says, I quote, "As yet, there are no known examples of Chinese land acquisitions in Africa in excess of 50,000 hectares, where deals have been concluded and projects implemented. China's friendship farms in various African countries are formally owned by a Chinese parastatal organization, but are mostly medium scale, usually below 1,000 hectares. So there's nothing about China. This is the fake news. This is the big lie. Then we looked at who is really land grabbing, because there are real land grabbing happening in Africa, and we discovered that Europeans are land grabbing in Africa. And we looked at reports commissioned by the UN Commission, by Friends of Earth. They are not friends of us, but they did a field study in Africa. And the European Parliament had a heated debate in 2016, and they came out with conclusions. And all the evidence points out that European companies, mostly British and Scandinavian, they are taking large parts of land, fertile land and water in Africa to produce what? Not food, but biofuels. They are planting jatropha and sugarcane to distill them to produce biodiesel and ethanol for cars in Europe. And this created a big outcry, but you don't see reports about that. The only thing which sticks in the mind is that there are 1 million Chinese taking land in Africa. We document this in our report. So I go back to my friend Jason Ross's statement that Africa must leap ahead, not crawl slowly forward. And this is not simply, it's a very good metaphor, but it's also a scientific statement. Because US and European politicians have been proposing that developing nations should not make the mistake of rapid industrial development, and instead must crawl slowly through appropriate technologies. To understand this one, you need to read Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, extracting sun rays from cucumber. There were scientists working on it. So what do you mean? Appropriate for Africans? Appropriate technology for Africans? Why? Why not other technologies used in the United States and Europe, like nuclear power? Why should Africans have a different kind of technology? What do you mean by appropriate? That Africans can't handle sophisticated and advanced technologies? No. The irony of the case, as the Chinese involvement shows, is that the development of Africa is that the deficit of basic infrastructure in Africa, as was in China, is an advantage, in that it allows nations to skip the intermediate stages of development that occurred over centuries in the industrial countries, of course, and to leapfrog directly into technologies that are at the frontier. This is the approach that China has taken, deploying high-speed railways and magnetically levitated trains and fourth-generation nuclear fission technology, and leaping ahead of the stagnating United States and Europe, rather than following the other way, going slowly from primitive technologies. So we have in the final part of the report these recommendations, which you can see briefly here, to the African nations and also the countries of Southwest Asia, is establishing a regional infrastructure development bank similar to the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the IIIB. Simultaneously, each nation should have a national credit mechanism, a national development bank, to internally finance parts of the infrastructure projects, which these nations can do themselves. Like as Dr. Saad was saying in Egypt, there are things the Egyptians can do, but they can be financed by internal credit. The other recommendation is integrating the infrastructure networks of Africa and Southwest Asia through the state-of-the-art high-speed railway systems, building and integrating navigation system across the rivers and lakes of Africa, developing the full potential of the hydropower of the rivers, building fourth-generation nuclear power plants for power generation and desalination of seawater. We will hear more about that tomorrow. Focusing on the upper value chains of the mining industry through petrochemical metal industries, rather than relying basically on exporting the raw materials out of Africa for hard currency, and also from the Middle East. We also recommend that creating a new green revolution in agriculture, similar to the Indian and Asian green revolutions, through developing new strains of higher yielding, disease and drought-resisting crops, reducing the waste of agricultural products through better processing, preserving, and transportation of agricultural products. Another recommendation is to focus on science and future-driven education programs with special focus on producing scientists, engineers, and workforce capable of handling frontier technologies like nuclear power, high-speed transport, and even space technologies. Finally, a quick review I have of the most spectacular things that have happened. But first of all, we have what we recommend as mega projects for Africa, which we have in our report, to connect Africa, Southwest Asia to the One Belt and One Road. And just to remind people, we are not talking about trade routes where you transfer goods from China to Europe or China. We are talking about development corridors, a concept which has been propagated by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, that you build infrastructure to bring technology, resources, and know-how and population to regions that are close to these possibilities. So we have this is some of the recent projects. I think our friend from China also referenced them. This is the Djibouti-Addis Ababa railway inaugurated this year. It's combined with a national railway network development plan, which Ethiopia is working on, but also it includes industrial parks, industrial cities. Our friend today was also presented the Mombasa-Nairobi project, but it's not simply there's a series of development corridors that are being built simultaneously in Africa. In East Africa, these have been on the drawing boards for decades, but now they are being built. We have also the Benguela, the Angolan railway system, which is rebuilt. There was a British-built old system there. The Chinese took it away. They built a completely new one. But also, as you see, the intention is to connect the different countries in Africa. So although these are national projects, the intention is to bring them into the larger system. We have also a spectacular development in Egypt with the building of the new line of the Suez Canal, which President al-Sisi personally was engaged in accomplishing in record time. The reason I'm showing these things is that there is work being done by Africans, by African nations, but with the input of China, the process is much, much quicker now and can become much quicker. Morocco is building the first high-speed railway line in all of Africa. It's in cooperation with Alstom and France, but the financing is not done in the right way. It's done through commercial loans, which would be a problem in the future. But all these countries have fantastic national development plans. And of course, Transaqua, which will be discussed today, is the very central centerpiece of development in Africa, because not only it will save Lake Chad, but because it connects many trans-African development corridors, creating a massive agro-industrial center right in the center of Africa, where it's the worst conditions we have today. So we have to look at all these things as integrated ideas, one idea, not simply separate projects here and there. But each nation has to have its own development plan, but the development plan has to be integrated into the larger plan. So we recommend that instead of the highway, the road highways, which roads are useful, but not for long-haul transportation, it should be replaced by high-speed railway networks, both for cargo and for passenger travel. We also recommend building an integrated African river system. There is no reason why we shouldn't have in Africa what we have in Europe, the Danube-Rhine river system, which is a fantastic transport medium. All this is possible. As I said earlier, there's nothing unrealistic about these things. All these things can be built. We have also another mega project, is the Grand Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which will be the largest hydropower project in the world in history of mankind. It would be twice as big as the Three Gorges Dam of China. Now there's a Chinese and Spanish company who are the last bidders for that, and the issue is not resolved, but the Republic of Congo government, they are open to building this project. So this will add 40,000 megawatts of power to Africa, but that would not be enough in itself, but this is a big advancement. We also recommend that African nations start working intensively on the fourth generation nuclear power. I think we have an expert who is discussing. Only South Africa has had a nuclear power program with an existing power technology, but this high temperature gas-cooled reactor type, this is perfect for Africa, for power generation, for water desalination and safety. We have these other mega projects that need to be built to connect Africa to Europe too. We have the Gibraltar tunnel, which should be built, and it should include the building a high-speed railway, extending it from, which is built now, as I showed, into Madrid. It will reduce the travel time between Casablanca and Madrid to 5 hours from 11 hours. We have also the Sicily-Tunisia tunnel and bridge with 5 artificial islands in between. Now, this is not to transport refugees or immigrants. This we want to use to transport capital goods, machines, technology, engineers, scientists, musicians, tourists, and so on and so forth. So the Italians have nothing to be afraid of when we build Africa. It's actually good for the Italians themselves and for Europe. So anyway, that's my conclusion statement, which I hope will be remembered in 2030 and 2050. According to the United Nations, by 2050, the bulk of the world's population growth will take place in Africa. Of the additional 2.4 billion people projected to be born between 2015 and 2050, 1.3 billion will be added in Africa. By 2030, Southwest Asia and Africa will have jointly contributed the greatest population growth, which is 46.9% above 2015 levels, out of all world regions, reaching 1.9 billion in 2030, 1.9 billion more people on the planet, with an amazing median age of only 23. So the average age would be 23 years in Africa and Southwest Asia. So those who think this is a major problem belong to the old paradigm, while those who believe this is a great opportunity belong to the new. If we get things to work, we might see Africa evolve into the next decade into a new China miracle with African characteristics. As Mr. Lyndon LaRouche have always emphasized, it is the future which determines the present, not the other way around. It is our vision of the future which defines our actions in the present. Thank you very much.